Vaping crisis of 2019. Dr. Sussman.
All right, good evening, everybody. This is Adam Hergenretter, an 18-year-old from Derby, Illinois, a normal, healthy teen, varsity wrestler on his high school wrestling team. Like many of his peers, Adam was using electronic cigarettes. He had been vaping for about 1.5 years when, this past summer, he started to develop nausea, vomiting, chills, and difficulty breathing, which gradually got worse with time to the point where he had to go to the hospital. There, the specialists who evaluated him determined that he had the lung function of a 70-year-old. His breathing function deteriorated to the point where ultimately he had to be treated in the intensive care unit. Adam Hergenretter is one of many recent victims of this new epidemic that is taking a toll on the youth of our society, vaping-related lung injury. The story of vaping actually starts as an extension of a much older and much better known public health hazard, that of tobacco. Tobacco, of course, has been around for a long time, having been developed centuries ago and used at that time by Native Americans. This was quickly taken up by the European settlers when they came along, and its use spread throughout the world and bolstered through the 20th century thanks to many celebrity endorsements, and thanks also to cigarette ads which sought to portray a somehow positive image associated with smoking. Thus, it was no surprise that by the mid-20th century, cigarettes became a ubiquitous part of our society. But it wasn't long before the deleterious health effects became apparent. Coronary artery disease, strokes, emphysema, cancer, not just of the lung, but also the mouth, throat, pancreas, bladder. Tobacco usage was thus gradually restricted more and more to the point that by the end of the 20th century, smoking was effectively banned in almost all public areas, and thus tobacco use had dropped precipitously by that point. Meanwhile, to help people quit smoking, being as it was known that nicotine was the addictive substance in tobacco, various nicotine replacement products were introduced to help people quit smoking, one of which was the electronic cigarette. It started out innocently enough as a device which simulated the actions of a cigarette, but instead of tobacco smoke, delivered a vapor that was a mix of water and nicotine. However, as the 21st century came along, its use as a recreational device started to pick up. There were various factors involved. For one, being as smoking was in public spaces was effectively banned, young people needed something else to do in public. There was this misperception that electronic cigarettes were somehow safer than tobacco. And once again, we had celebrity endorsements, but this time, instead of print ads, what we now have are social media influencers, again portraying vaping now as somehow cool and glamorous. Vaping was further motivated by the development of vaping solutions with various flavors, and as marijuana gradually became legal in parts of the US in recent years, manufacturers started adding marijuana derivatives such as THC and CBD oil. Thus, e-cigarette use just took off over the past 15 years to the point that by 2018, according to CDC data, over 3.6 million minors, children, were using e-cigarettes. Almost 5% of middle school students and over 20% of high school students. And the healthcare community was looking on with great concern. Here was a new technology, very little of which had been known or studied, except for the fact that we are now creating a new generation of nicotine addicts, and that obviously was not good. But what of all the additives the flavorings, the marijuana derivatives. What happens when you vaporize those and then expose people's lungs to a highly concentrated vapor of this? What's going to happen? Nobody knew, but everyone's worst fears were soon realized. This past summer, starting in July, the CDC began to notice a severe uptick in severe respiratory symptoms in young patients who were otherwise healthy, but who reported a history of vaping. And likewise, they noticed a severe uptick of hospitalizations as a result, and these numbers continue to rise. As of the most recent data, there are now over 1,200 cases of vaping-related lung injury reported in 49 states, including 26 deaths. These are young patients with a median age of 24. Autopsy studies on the lungs of these patients were reported as showing what were described as chemical burns of the lung. And what they mean is this. Here's a normal lung looked at under the microscope. What you see are air spaces lined by a delicate web of tissue containing capillaries, which is where the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide would normally take place. Now you will notice lining these air spaces is a layer of very small, tiny, almost imperceptible cells, such as the one shown with the arrow. You can barely see it, but pay attention because these cells are important for our discussion. Here are some images from a patient who died from vaping-related lung injury. Now I want you to focus on the two on the bottom. The bottom left is image C. Now again, you'll see an airspace lined by these cells, such as the one shown with a thin arrow, but you'll notice the cells now are much larger, much easier to see. What this means is that something is attacking these cells. Yes?
What's A, B, C, and D?
Okay, these are various images. This actually came from the New England Journal of Medicine. I didn't read the full article, so I don't know what they're for, but just focus on C and D. Okay, also the thick arrow shows an area where the cells are gone, meaning that now they've been killed off by whatever's attacking them, and the tissue is exposed to air. That's bad. It sets off a severe inflammatory reaction, and what you see in the airspace now, instead of air, is inflammatory cells. Now when you look at the D, where the arrow is, again we have the airspace, this time filled with a pinkish substance which is blood clot. All of this is what's known as acute respiratory distress syndrome, a very severe respiratory compromise, and which can be fatal if patients are not quickly hospitalized, and frequently they need to be maintained in the intensive care unit. If they are, they can eventually survive. What is attacking these cells? What is in the vapor that is doing this? No one knows for sure. And this is an area of active investigation by the CDC. And until we know better, it is best to heed the warnings of the CDC and to lay off the e-cigarettes. As for Adam Hergenreder, he did eventually survive and was able to leave the hospital, but he still suffers from reduced lung function to this day, gets winded just from climbing the stairs, likely will never be able to wrestle again, and he has now become an advocate against e-cigarettes. And his message to all of us, be safe, don't vape. Thank you.